Welcome to Unraveling Education, the podcast that's part storytelling, part information, and part whodunit. We'll be investigating the underlying issues harming the public education system and identifying the key players involved. Greetings, I'm Danielle Ford, former trustee of the Clark County School District. As you've probably heard, Superintendent Jara, aka my arch nemesis, is officially out for good this time, and the search for a new district leader is afoot. In this episode, I'm chatting with CCSD educator of 17 years, Robert Cowles. Aside from his educator perspective, he has a deep historical knowledge of the district and governance happenings. He's a wealth of information, and he often sees answers to things before anyone else does, so I wanted to grab his insights into issues like CCSD's superintendent history, national superintendent training programs such as Chiefs for Change, Broad Academy, and others, best qualities for a future CCSD superintendent, what kind of selection process should be used, and the Nevada State Legislature's role in all of this. Robert and I both have ADHD, so naturally we also covered topics like literacy and pre-K, the Great Recession, the Cuban Missile Crisis, cell phones in class, video games, and the bizarre fascination with kids watching other kids play video games, Barbie, and more. Before we jump in, production of these episodes is made possible by donations from individuals. If you would like to support the show, you could do so by visiting unravelingeducation.com, where you will find several easy ways to help. Now, on to the main event. So let me tell you why I wanted you on this podcast, because you're an educator and you've been in CCSD a long time, but a lot of people have. There's like a lot of educators I could have probably chosen, right? My experience as a trustee and coming in as an outsider, but I understood the community, I understand Vegas, and seeing like everybody that's coming and talking to the board on different sides of the aisle and whatnot. I've always thought that you always had super good insight, and every time that I have like looked back at meetings from a year ago or 2 years ago, I'm like, why didn't we listen to Robert? And then when I was, really researching the previous boards, and I would go back to meetings from 5 or 10 years ago, I'm like, Jesus Christ, like all anyone had to do is listen to Robert. Like you have your public comments, you might as well be holding a crystal ball in some of these. I even went to Jara in the few months that I was trying to get along with him, and really before I realized that it wasn't going to happen, when I was really trying, that I had hope. And I'm like, hey, I think you should bring in Robert Cowles as an advisor. He really has his pulse on what's going on. He's, really good at predicting what's going to happen, putting things together. And then he would just obviously shut that down. But truthfully, you have such good insight into not just CCSD, but the state of Nevada and things that are happening nationally. And I think it's probably the way your brain works, that you're able to connect these dots, and you might not see yourself as an expert and stay humble or whatever, but I have picked up on you being a person that anybody should be talking to if they're trying to fix CCSD. So that's why I wanted you on the podcast.
It's that neurodivergent, I overthink a lot of things. And as a history person, everything's connected, and it's not straight line. There are no straight lines in history. It's this weird web of things that connect. And because I don't understand why we've done all of the things that we've done, and I'm trying to figure out why are we doing this. The only explanation I have for why I'm insightful, because there's so many things about what people do that don't make any sense to me at all. You just kind of go, why? So
that's how I am too. I feel like because we're both neurodiverse, kind of similarly, but it's almost like I try to understand people through researching other people. Why did this person do that thing in the past? Okay, well, maybe that's why this person now in my present is doing that thing, because I don't always do things for the same reason people do things. So it's trying to figure out why things happened. How long have you been in the district, and what subject do you teach?
I hit my 17th anniversary January 2nd of this year. I started teaching middle school U.S. history and world geography, and I stayed in middle school for 10 years. I loved it. I don't think I would have left had I not been surplused because of budget cuts. I'm a social studies teacher. I've taught in middle school, seventh grade US history, eighth grade world geography. At the high school level, I've taught world history, US history, AP human geography, AP US history, and government. Currently, I'm at Cimarron Memorial High School. I'm teaching U.S. history that's a dual credit through the University of Nevada, Reno, and then I'm teaching the rest of the classes that I'm teaching are a senior guidance class. It's been an interesting year.
I'm sure. And then I can't even imagine how you're teaching like under these circumstances right now with the district and just like the way like, kids are in society. And like, I don't know how any of you are doing it, but God bless you. Thank you.
Oh, I mean, kids have changed a lot. When I started teaching, there were kids that had smartphones. Not very many, but there were a few. And all the way through until the pandemic hit, they were a minor annoyance. Put your phone away. Okay, they put their phone away. After the pandemic, they're it's their escape hatch. The weirdest teaching during the pandemic, having them in here. I, I I don't know. I don't understand why people tell me I'm intimidating, and it's just I have the male equivalent of resting bitch face. I just have that kind of look. It's some of it is the neurodivergent thing.
I envy you. I think I have resting happy face. And it's not good because it's like I'm walking through the store, I'm going through the parking lot, and people like want to come talk to me or they think I want them to come talk to me. And I'm like, no, 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 that's not what that was.
Oh,
That's just my face.
people do that to me all the time too, though. Um, Everywhere I go, people stop me and ask me things, and it's like, do I look
Why?
friendly and approachable?
Well, and also you're like super woke, but you don't like look like you'd be woke.
No,
So that could be confusing for people.
that is a thing. When the trustees were talking about the gender diverse policy, and it was at the Clark County building, their meeting room, and I was over on the side with the trans community, and I had a bunch of people looking at me like, who is this person and
Okay,
why is
you're on
he?
the wrong side.
Yeah, and then I went up and spoke,
You got your American flag.
and I went up and spoke, and they were like, "Oh, he's just bald. That's just it's just," and it's like,
Bald and a beard and a gun supporter and American flag and also super woke.
well, and I mean, yeah, I have an American. That's a historical flag. That flag
Oh,
was on.
okay.
That flag was on the observation island when they test launched the first Polaris missile in 1959.
I
My
don't know
grand
what any of that is.
Okay. The Polaris missile was, those are the ones that we put in our ballistic missile submarines. We shoot them from underneath the water out of submarines
Okay.
from anywhere in the world. And they're in this housing, and it uses like compressed air. The whole thing comes up out of the water in its little casing, and the casing kind of breaks away, and then the missile kind of floats there for a second, and then the rocket engages, and it goes off, and it ends the world. Um, my grandfather ran the ballistic missile tests on every one of the first 41 ballistic missile submarines that we launched. He was involved in engineering the guidance system for those. So um, in U.S. naval speak, it's our SSBNs. So submersible ship ballistic missile. They're um, the submarines that have missiles in them, that like the Hunt for Red October kind of a thing, where you can shoot ballistic missiles out of the water. We've since converted a bunch of them into so that they can shoot Tomahawk missiles, and we've seen some of those recently in the from the Red Sea shooting at Houthi rebels, because they can hold like 100 and something, 154 Tomahawk missiles, and shoot them from underwater, so they can't be seen when they're shooting them. And this
I'm
is
going to be researching this all night now. So I didn't expect my evening to go in this direction. So thanks for that.
yeah. Well, you're welcome.
Let's talk about the superintendents that you have experience working under. So I want to get a clear understanding of what the district was like at different points in time going back through your career, and how much of what was going on you think was the superintendent, what was impacted. So we have Jesus Hara
Okay.
from 2018 until current.
It was somebody else told me about the Broad Institute, and it was when they were considering when they had the list of the three candidates for the superintendent when he was hired. I was like, okay, let's talk to people in other states. Let's talk to the people. DC was from LA Unified. He had like corruption and scandal. There was another guy from Colorado who runs like a small school district, and the people in Colorado loved him. And he had established a good relationship with the legislature. He had a good relationship with the unions, with the support professionals, teachers, and admin. I mean, he built a collective relationship. And then there was Jesus Hara, which for some reason we say Jesus Jara. And, I got a hold of people that I knew from different union stuff, from the National Bats Facebook group, and people that I had met at the NEA convention. I'd been to two of them. And so I knew a couple of people in that area, and I reached out and I was like, hey, what can you tell me about this guy? And they were like, oh, let's see. Well, he's terrible at communication, and he's one of those like my way or the highway, kind of a bully, kind of a guy. And then, people were like, he's also a Brody. And I was like, okay, what's a Brody? And I went to the board and I was like, okay, DC and this Hara guy, please don't hire them. We went down the list. There were a whole bunch of us that went down and said, please don't hire this man. They had a conversation about Mike Barton, not Danielle, that's you. Deanna Wright was talking about how people had threatened her, um, and tried to bully her into picking him. And I know that Barton had widespread support, especially among administrators, and I'm sure some of them went and tried to lean on her to try to influence her, and it was a bad idea. And so they passed on Mike Barton. What I've heard, although I have no way of knowing, is that Carolyn Edwards didn't like Ava White, and so she called the question for Jesus Hara, and four of them voted yes, and two of them voted no, and that was it.
So at that point in time, there was an interim superintendent, Pat Skorkowski, correct?
When Dwight Jones left, Skorkowski was picked to be the interim superintendent, and I don't remember how long he was the interim superintendent before essentially everybody just kind of went, why don't we just he's a good guy. He's been with the district all of this time. He's more than qualified. Why don't we just keep him as the superintendent? Why are we going through all of this stuff? We went through all of this stuff when we got Dwight Jones, and we got Dwight Jones, and before him we had an interim. It was Walt Wolfels. When I started, he was the superintendent, or he became the superintendent shortly thereafter. So when I started mid-school year in 2007, he was the superintendent. I know from talking with other people, they talked about Carlos Garcia, who was the superintendent before him, and he went off to McGraw-Hill. So we had Walt, who wasn't an educator. He was like an accountant, but he was involved, and he had. He has the distinction of being superintendent when the economy went sideways with the Great Recession. And so we had, dramatic budget cuts, and we started school years with, my second and third year at Brindley, our whole first aid kit was a Band-Aid, a cotton ball, and a single latex glove. And it was like I went from buying, pencils and colored pencils and markers and paper to buying Band-Aids and, wipes, and in addition to all of the other stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, we had after Walt, we had Dwight Jones, and they did a search. And he was also from the Broad Institute. There was a lot of optimism when he came on, and he was here. and there were, there was widespread rumors about him being inappropriate with subordinates or something. I don't remember any of the details. And then all of a sudden he was gone. Like something, he was the stated reason was there was something about his mother's health, and he left and went back to, I want to say, Colorado, and then all of a sudden he had a different job somewhere else. The big thing I remember about him is that, like, every time Deanna Wright saw him in the years after that, she just like swooned all over him, kind of thing. She was absolutely smitten with him. And
So then he came back. He said he
no,
went to
no, no.
Colorado.
Like he was gone from CCSD, but like they'd go to a conference or they'd go to some sort of
Oh,
training
okay.
or they'd, whatever.
Hmm.
And every time she talked about him, you could tell that she always spoke very highly of him. And then we had Pat Skorkowski, and he was interim, and we were supposed to have some kind of big search, kind of a thing. There was a lot of talk in the community. There were a lot of building level admin who knew him from some sort of connection or another, and so there was a lot of positive talk about Pat Skorkowski. I don't know. I think the biggest issues with Skorkowski were funding related. We just did not have the funding to do anything. And so, he was always in that position of doing the best you can with what resources you have. And that was the same thing with Walt. It's like Ruffles,
I think it's
but
just
it
Ruffles. Isn't it just
Ruffles, or
pronounced?
yeah,
Is it?
yeah. It's not like Ruffles the chips. it's like
I've always
it's
heard it
like
pronounced like that, but maybe they're
I,
pronouncing it wrong.
I'm sure we're all mispronouncing his name, and as somebody who
Okay.
has a name that's being mispronounced all the time, I sympathize. But doing the best you can with what you have under Walt and under Skorkowski, like our staffing ratio went down. We were like staffed at 97% for a while, and then we were staffed down to 95%. So you had 95% of the teachers that you were supposed to have is what you were budgeted for.
So that
That was
wasn't
where we're
like teachers leaving, though. That was like, we just don't have the funding for teachers, right?
Yeah, it was. We have less money to work with, so instead of saying you should have 100 teachers in your building, we're going to say, oh, we're down to 97%, so you'll have 97 teachers instead of 100 teachers. And then when it went to 95%, you'll have 95 teachers instead of 100 teachers that we agree you should have, but
Hmm.
we don't have the funding to pay for it. And as far as I know, we've never actually corrected that. We've never gone back to saying, okay, look, we have the money to pay for the number of teachers that we're supposed to have so that we have, reasonable class sizes. My
They're probably not worried about it since we don't have enough teachers to
Yeah, we
fill
don't have
that
enough
fill
teachers
that up.
to fill that anyway.
So I want to go through what I have as a timeline of superintendents,
Okay.
and then we'll talk about that. So first of all, are you familiar with the ABC PAC?
ABC PAC, that's the one that's the former trustees and other interested community people that are trying to get their candidates elected to the board of trustees. I don't know
Okay.
who's behind them or anything like that. I've heard of them. It's, they're like, Lola Brooks is our person, and they wanted Irene Cepeda to be reelected, and yeah.
I'm going to have a separate episode later on, closer to election time,
Okay.
specifically about this because I want people to know more about that at that point. But I thought it was very interesting that when Carlos Garcia was hired in 2000,
Hmm.
and he was replacing a superintendent named Brian Cram.
Uh-huh.
So now Brian Cram was like the superintendent when I was mostly in school. And from what I've heard people say is he's like the best superintendent CCSD has ever had. So that's over 20 years ago. I need to get more information on Brian Cram, but I started here with Carlos Garcia because I thought it was interesting that, first of all, he is a Brody. And of the 7 trustees that were on the board at that time, 4 of them are in the ABC PAC.
Hmm.
So that's kind of like, I have more to look into that. And,
Right.
the similarities are that these are the people who are still supporting the same pipeline of superintendent candidates and trustees that support the Broadies and the Chiefs for Change. That's just kind of something I thought was interesting.
Right.
And I know a lot of people following the podcast are kind of like trying to put those pieces together. So there's something there, and we're having a future investigatory episode. And so that's one of the things that we're going to dive more into to prepare for election time and to arm people with that information. So that was 2000. They hired Carlos Garcia,
Right.
a Brody. And I'm trying to keep like opinions out of this. I'm just going with facts, like, who's connected to who, what kind of things happened in the district, what, did we lose teachers? If so, what were the reasons? Was it because of cuts? Was it because of the way that it was being operated? So there's a few people that support Carlos Garcia, but from what I've heard, they weren't super happy with him as superintendent, and they thought the district went downhill majorly from when Brian Cram was superintendent. When I ran for the board and I was, thinking about my experience as a student, I'm like, the district sucked and it failed me and I dropped out and all these things. But then when I learned, it's like the things that failed me actually have been fixed. And a lot of them are more like, now we have supports for neurodivergent students. And now there's more empathy to that. And now we are tracking when students are going to different schools, and now we understand how like home life might affect kids, grades
Right.
and whatnot. But it's like the things that I loved about school when I was in CCSD, we're not doing anymore. I mean, we had the community. I had Girl Scouts at my school, theater. I was a theater kid. That saved me. That's probably why I even stayed in school for as long as I did. We had going to town days where we could be like entrepreneurs and all these like fun things and that families loved. We're not doing anymore. So it's almost like I feel like people my age are still like, well, CCSD sucked then and now it sucks now. But it's like very different reasons of what's happening in education. Right. And to me, it almost feels like this was the shift into a whole other form of education. So then you had Carlos Garcia, and he resigned in July of 2005, and then Walt, so then was appointed. So I think this is interesting too, that he was appointed, and even though he wasn't an educator, he wasn't connected to Chiefs for Change or the Broad Foundation at all.
Right.
And then I think about this, because a lot of people said they really liked him as superintendent. And then if you think about the way the board is supposed to work, is supposed to like think about what's going on at the moment. And if it really is like, the economy and you need somebody like who's really good financially, then maybe it is the right choice to bring in some sort of like fiscally minded person at that moment, So maybe that was a good choice. Then during his term is when we got Carolyn Edwards, Chris Garvey, Deanna Wright, and Linda Young. Mm-hmm. And so, they all served for 12 years. They came on when he was superintendent. They came on in 2009. And so Dwight Jones came in 2010 under basically the same board that was there when I joined, those four trustees. And also Terry Janison, Sheila Moulton, who now is involved in the charter school. She's like the charter authorizer on the charter board. So that's what the board looked like at this point, just to get a clear picture. You got Carolyn Edwards, you got Janison, who's on the ABC PAC. You got Moulton, who's on the ABC PAC. You got Deanna Wright, who listens to Carolyn Edwards. And then, of course, Dr. Young and Garvey. So then Dwight resigned in March of 2013. And that's when Pat Skorkowski was appointed.
Right.
And he was interim, and then 2 months later appointed as superintendent. Then we got 2017, Pat Skorkowski leaves and Jara comes in 2018 with a contract that ended in 2021, but ended up ending in 2026, getting him an actual payout for when he resigned. April 26, 2018, a month before they decided Jara would be hired. And it has Robert Coles suggested that during the interviews, the board should consider how the candidates plan to rebuild the relationship between CCSD and the employees. That might have been helpful.
Might have been, yeah.
Maybe a little bit. At that same time, Linda Young, who at this point, had been on the board 8 years already, her and Aaron Craner were like, we need a private attorney. And so in the months before Jara getting hired, they had drafted up this board counsel and chief negotiator that would have actually put, right now, Jara hires a chief negotiator and that negotiator reports to him. But according to what they were looking for and what I think is supposed to happen in school boards, that the chief negotiator goes and talks to the unions and debates contracts and then reports to the board, not the superintendent. Even if the superintendent's there, they're like taking direction straight from the board, and the board should have it in their budget to pay that person.
Right.
and, make final decisions and stuff.
Chiefs for Change, they've like siphoned off a bunch of things that trustees are
Yep.
supposed to do and um, put it squarely in the superintendent's wheelhouse. It belongs to him now. It's operational. Sorry.
It is it's exactly that. And so I'm always trying to wonder like how much of this that the trustees have done as far as giving away their power for something like this, for something like making sure that the chief negotiator that's negotiating contracts and whatnot. I mean, how could it have looked during the past several contract negotiations if it actually was the board that had somebody coming and talking to us about what was happening, and that person, the chief negotiator, like knew that we were their boss and not Jara? Like, how might that have been different? You know what I
Right.
mean? So I'm always like, where's the fiduciary line? Where's the line between this is your federal responsibility to work with the people that you contract with, like the unions, and your own policies that maybe say, I don't want to do that. We'll let the superintendent handle that. I
Right.
don't really have that answer, but that's something I'm always pondering.
The trustees should have their own attorney, their own negotiator, their own staff who report to them and who are not, uh, dependent on the will or the whims of the superintendent or suffer retaliation at the hands of a superintendent. It has to be separate from the superintendent, because if the superintendent is their boss or the person that evaluates them or the person that can decide whether or not they have a job, then the superintendent can you know manipulate them into doing things because they're worried about what the superintendent will or won't do to them as a result of that. They'll obviously be employees of the Clark County School District, but they would report to the trustees. They haven't been reporting to the trustees, as far as I know, ever. It became more narrowed under Superintendent Jara.
Okay, let me tell you the history of this. I was brand new. I'm observing. I really don't know what the hell I'm doing in meetings, but I'm listening to public comment and I'm researching everything, trying to put it together. And I made clear decisions. I didn't know anything about the two different unions. I didn't know what the history was, but it was very easy for me to spot. Well, I mean, the teachers' unions, basically. The two different
Yeah,
educator.
no, I was.
You're thinking police and like all that, or the
Well, no,
support and
I was
admin.
thinking support, admin, teachers, but then there's also police unions. Yeah.
So four that we negotiate with, but two educator unions that are always like, or associations or whatever, they're always battling each other. So I didn't know this like drama at all, but it was very easy for me to determine like who I wanted to go to get more information and who I thought like knew what they were talking about. Didn't even know you guys were like friends or like in the same group or anything. But it was you and it was Alexis Saul and Vicky Kreidel mostly. And a couple months in, I went to Vicky. I'm like, hey, can I ask you a question? This is going to sound crazy. Like, I know this sounds nutty. I'm like, I just can't get it out of my mind. I'm like, what would you do if I told you that I have this lingering feeling of like, is Jara actually a shill to ruin the school district? I didn't even know what the word privatization was in the sense of education or anything. I'm like, I just feel like everything he's doing and everything I'm seeing him ignore and the decisions that he's making that are opposite of what everyone is telling him, even the trustees, it feels like it's to ruin the district. Am I crazy? And she goes, oh, well, he's a Brody. I'm like, that's not a word I've ever heard in my life. And so she kind of told me about it. And then she was like, well, I learned that from Robert Cowles. And so that's when I hit you up and I'm like, what is Brody? And then you told me that like there's a plan to privatize. That's when I learned the first word privatize school districts and take them over and charter and all these things. And that's really when, I started like looking into it. But so at that point, I was super new and maybe a couple years in when then we dealt with COVID and it was just chaos. But, when I was really trying to figure stuff out, especially when Jara started screwing with us and trying to get his contract extended and making up lies and things, I would go into the board office and ask the secretary for certain meetings that I wasn't involved in. And my goal was to see what the trustees were doing before me. I wasn't even like looking for information. I was like, is this something they're telling me I can't do this? And they're telling me we can't direct our negotiator in this way. Is that something that's always happened or is it new? And so I only went back a couple years. And if I had one thing I could do different as far as that, I would have gone back to like back to like Brian Cram area before like a Chiefs for Change person even like came in. or a Brody came in, and be like, how is the board operating? It might not have been perfect, but like, were they in charge of this, and were they making direction and making decisions in this way? So I'm kind of putting that out there because if any other CCSD trustees are listening right now, you have the ability to go to your secretary and say, let me listen to some closed meetings from X, Y, and Z. You have to go alone in the office, and then you listen to them, and you give the recording back, and it stays there, and you can't share any of that information or whatever. But I think it'd be really important for the board to know before getting a new superintendent how they actually should be working with that person, directing that person, and directing negotiations with the district. That would be really helpful. So I did learn that pre-JARA, it was much different, and there was no operational being told to anybody. I'll tell you something else that happened around late 2019. I was just losing my mind. I'm like, no one got me the book about balanced governance. Nobody told me this was a thing. And then I learned that the board used to have a liaison, and it was like an assistant role that was the board's liaison, and would work with the board members and communicate to the superintendent and communicate to different departments. Under the board, we paid this person's salary. They reported to us. I'm like, why don't we have that? And it's because that position was cut. JARA cut that position because JARA said that the superintendent is the board's liaison to the community, to the staff, to department heads, and whatnot. I was so mad. Dr. Young was like, I was mad when they cut that position. Do you want to try to bring it up again? I'm like, yeah. So we did, and we went through this whole process, and we hired Joe Caruso, and he became the board's liaison. You might think this is interesting because I went to Cimarron, and I only made it to the grade that you teach, the middle of 11th grade. But my ex-husband and a bunch of my friends also went to Cimarron, and they all had a government teacher named Joe Caruso. So I never got government. I never learned government in high school, but the person who would be my government teacher ended up being my assistant. So we hired Joe, brought him on. He's under the board. And then we get an email from our secretary saying, trustees, this is on behalf of Superintendent Jara. From now on, Joe will be reporting to him. And do not message Joe Caruso anything without CCing the superintendent as well. And then he changed his signature to board liaison to the superintendent, office of the superintendent, started getting paid from the superintendent, and reporting to the superintendent as far as what he could do to help us. That's something that needs to be taken into account when hiring a new superintendent, since that's where we are at this point in life in the process, is that the board does not have its own attorney and its own general counsel, and the one that the district has reports to the superintendent, and the liaison position reports to the superintendent. So it's almost like that should be considered when talking to a superintendent. Do you support passing that back to the board, or do you think this is a way that it should operate, in the sense that you are the liaison to the board and all these other people need to report to you? Let's say magic wand is given to Robert, and you have to figure out within 30 days, what's the search process going to be for a new superintendent? What are the criteria, and how would the board go about finding a new superintendent and selecting that person?
Oh, geez.
Top of your mind.
I understand the idea of wanting to outsource certain elements of that, of going and looking for a superintendent of people who are qualified and people who are interested. The problem is that all of the search firms are either connected to the Council of Great City Schools or Chiefs for Change, which formerly the Broad Institute. So they're all kind of connected to each other.
Or could be bought if somebody approached them and hey, here's some money, throw our candidates in there.
Yeah. I think we should have all of these kind of a selection process. Before there was, we have to look at the internal candidate. No, we have to look at an external candidate. No, we actually have to look at internal candidates and external candidates, and people that were here in CCSD and kind of right up in that level, and then left because they couldn't get hired as superintendent because we decided we had to go to the outside. And we've had a number of pretty good upper district administrators, building level and into that deputy superintendent kind of
range, or associate superintendent, or they've all changed names so many times, that, we should be looking at them too. And we should be looking at deputy superintendents, associate superintendents around the country in large urban districts. We should be looking at superintendents in smaller districts. We should be casting that big net. In a perfect world, I'd like to see somebody that didn't have any affiliation with, Chiefs for Change or the Broad Institute or the Council of the Great City Schools, but I don't know that anything like that actually exists. I think because they have such a wide footprint on education in the United States today, that you're going to find anybody who's actually qualified to run a district like the Clark County School District that hasn't had some connection or some training or something with any of those organizations. And I have worked with, people that, they got their admin license and they ended up working in the central office doing, CPD or some other level of thing. And then they go and they move over back to like a building level administrator, like an assistant principal kind of thing. Typically speaking, when you go from assistant principal to principal at the middle and high school level, you have to have done the different roles of the assistant principal. You have to have done curriculum, you have to have run the sports stuff, you have to have done, the facilities stuff. And then you get that step to uh, building principal. At a high school level, you have to have done all of those things before you can be a building principal, before you're typically considered to be a building level principal. I'm sure there are building principals who, skipped one or two of those little steps along the way and ended up going, and instead of going up and they go, and then they go, and they're a building principal kind of a thing. And then from there, you go from being a building principal to being, an administrator, an associate or deputy superintendent. It seems like we used to have a bunch of associate superintendents and then a few deputy superintendents, and then the superintendent used to be that thing. And then under JARA, we eliminated a bunch of the associate superintendents and just had the deputy superintendents. And now we're trying to go back to having some of those associate super, and people are like all mad because we've added all of this middle level uh, uh, admin between the superintendent and a building level principal. But we used to have those people, and we need those people. We need people to be in schools, you know, meeting with the principal, watching, doing the observations on principals. They're the ones that evaluate building level principals. They're the ones that, give them suggestions, and all of that. Um, so in that sense, we're talking about the again, the on paper qualifications. Have you done at least a certain number of, and I don't know how many is the right number. Have you done those associate deputy superintendent roles in a decent sized district? Have you been a superintendent of a district? I think that, that should at least qualify you for consideration of perhaps a smaller district, because it's really just a matter of scale. Do you have the vision? Do you have that real experience solving the problems that we have? And we have a bunch of problems. We have, a huge number of teacher vacancies. We're a large urban district that also has a lot of rural components to it. And those are things that should be considered. Do you have that ability to work with those districts? Do you have the ability to work with a legislature that is hostile towards our school district as an entity, and has been for the 20 something years that I've lived in Las Vegas? Because that's going to be a thing. We have legislators that, they're the record increase in education funding in this last session, that's still like 44,000, $4,500 less than what their own study says that the district should be
Is the average,
funded at,
yeah.
for average per pupil funding. And they feel like they're just throwing money at the problem. And that's a comment, the CCSD is this black hole where you just throw money and it just goes and it disappears. And what are they spending all of that money on? And, all of those things. And, we have,
I mean, that's kind of a legit question, though.
well, I mean, Yeah, but when your own study says we should be spending what, $15,000 per pupil, and we're really only spending $5,000 or $10,000 per pupil, and in that district you still have internationally recognized programs and magnet schools and bands and orchestras and mariachi and robotics competition and the only aviation program in the entire state at all of these different schools that we have. We still manage, even though we are chronically underfunded, even though we are chronically understaffed, we still manage to do some truly remarkable things. And it's like, okay,
Totally.
what we need to figure out is, okay, so how do we do that for all of our students? We have
And then,
this.
but then to me, like, how do we get more of that and stop, let's say, an influx of money comes in, and now when the new contract for the testing company or their curriculum comes in, is it double the price now? And we're just spending the money that way? Like, how do we make sure it's going to the things that the community actually wants?
Or are we spending money on things that the only research that shows that it's actually useful is the research that comes from that company? We're
Right.
buying curriculum that is scripted. At the same time, it's trying to cover too much stuff while not actually covering the things that we need kids to be able to do.
And not making kids like being in school, which is the number one thing that we know is going to equate to their success.
The push for literacy and to teach kids how to read, we've sucked every bit of joy out of reading. My entire teaching career, I've had kids, essentially whine, I don't like to read. And it's hard, as somebody who grew up reading, as somebody who loves
Mm-hmm.
to read, as somebody
I
who has
love
a
reading.
stack of books on the desk next to me. A lot of our students come from cultures that don't read to their kids when they're young children. And we wonder why our kids come to school and they can't read. It's like we need to do that outreach to our community, to ask our parents to read to their kids when they're little, to continue to that process, and then to then kind of, I'm going to throw one of those, we're going to gradual release of responsibility to our students, to their children, where they're reading to their parents. That's that huge thing that pays huge dividends in their entire education process. If we want to talk about things like what do we do to improve our test scores, well, we get our kids to actually enjoy reading, because kids that actually enjoy reading read. And then when you give them something that they don't really want to read because it's a test prompt and it's something that they don't care about, they can read it and they can see, they can make the inferences, they can draw conclusions based on that, and they can do well when they're writing their answers to those things that make those test scores look really good. That whole concept is part of what's harming our students in the first place. And then we use it as justification to continue doing those things that harm our students and get them to turn them into people who don't like to read. We live in a country where half of our country reads at the sixth grade level. The adults in our country read at the sixth grade level. And it's because they hated reading, because they never got to read the things that they wanted to read. Or by the time they actually learned how to read, they were struggling, they were older, and they don't read a whole book. They read a 700 word passage. We have so many people that, after they leave high school, they'll never read a book. They'll read whatever they have to read, the forms that they have to fill out, the things like that. And they'll spend the rest of their time watching videos of something, whether it's a whole TV show or, 3 minutes of some kid playing a video game, which is
Mm-hmm.
another thing that I still don't understand. The whole
I can't
watching
handle it. I can't handle
people.
it when it's on my TV. It gives me a headache. And like
Uh,
just watching people shoot each other and you're watching someone else play, at least go play it yourself.
that's the thing. I play video games. Play the video
Yeah.
game. I
So
watched a
weird.
kid a couple of years ago who was watching somebody else's
It's my son. It's
gameplay
nonstop.
of Mario Brothers,
I know.
of a game that like I play on my Switch,
Yeah.
and I'm
And I'm
like,
like watching it and I'm like, I could do better than this. It's frustrating because you can't control the screen because it's someone else's
well, and I'm
playing.
like,
Like,
I'm
why
like,
do that
I'm
to
like, and
yourself?
I'm well, at first I thought he was playing it. I'm like, you missed the star that's behind the
Yeah.
thing, and he's
Like, give
like,
me the
oh,
control.
I'm
I'll do
I'm
this
watching.
for
He's
you.
like, no, I'm watching, and I'm like, you're watching somebody else play a video game. badly.
It's the strangest. Okay, I have a little bit of a differing opinion about something that you said. I just want to put it out there.
Okay. Then.
I totally agree about the literacy thing. I think it's absolutely important. It's everyone knows whatever side of the fence you're on knows like kids need to be able to read by a certain age. It's just like how to approach it that's different. But I disagree with it being the family's job because I try to live in like this world, like in a perfect world that families would read at night. But in this world, the parents might be dealing with mental health issues. They might be working jobs. The kid might be in a foster home. So then with what I can actually control and knowing that we can, get our hands into the kids' reading lives at any point in time if we had the funding, I think honestly the answer is just universal preschool for free. More Head Start programs for free.
I agree that I know millions of parents around the country there's so many barriers to being able to read to their kids. What I was talking about with that is culturally, there are groups that have students in our school systems that it's just not a normal practice.
Not a thing they do.
It's not a normal practice. I agree. Pre-K, universal pre-K is something we should have already done. Full day kindergarten is something we should be doing universally. There needs to be more recess and play involved, especially in pre-K through probably 4th or 5th grade. Honestly, 12th graders would benefit from play.
I benefit from it. I take rollerblading breaks.
Adults benefit from play. Part of that shift that we've had from the we're behind and we're deficient and we're all of these things, and so we're going to test you and use these scripted curriculums and test you again.
Cut down the recess and just get one more lesson in.
We've cut down all of that play that is part of the natural way that human beings learn naturally.
Okay, so there's something that I've been thinking about since like the meeting when Jara, his resignation was accepted and everyone gave public comment, and I'm listening to what people are saying they want in a superintendent and how we should conduct a search. And I think that that's good. We should listen to the community, but there's something like glaring that nobody's mentioned before or so far that I think is really important for everybody to like consider as you're giving the trustees suggestions as to how we should conduct a process. Do you remember how big of a deal it was when the state board came down on us because we're not following the reorg?
Oh yeah, because we're not following the law.
So I mean that was a whole thing. That's a later episode of the podcast because it was 2022 and they were going to take over. They were talking about putting someone in charge of us.
But the not following the reorg law predates Superintendent Jara. It was going on under Skorkowski as well.
Totally. The thought process though is that first of all, clearly I have an opinion about the Broad Foundation and Chiefs for Change, and my opinion is that it's not good, right? However, my opinion is also we need to do what the community wants. And if the community, for the most part, wants a superintendent search, or if they want this type of superintendent, it's out of my hands type thing. But how are we going to consider a national superintendent search where we're going to go to all these districts and bring someone in and have a repeat of Jara not understanding the reorg? The initial board, when hiring Jara, that should have been like the most important thing. Like, do you understand the law that just went into place a year before this new superintendent is coming in? And are you able to, keep the district in alignment with the reorg, this Nevada law that only applies to Clark County, in which we give some autonomy to principals and we have SOTs. Basically, I'm seeing legislators call for a national search. And these are the same people that did the reorg. Okay, so they're saying, hey, please go find somebody that's not in the state and bring them in here. And then I expect them to follow this law that we put in place and that we've been on your ass about for the past 5 years and asking you as a board why your superintendent isn't following it. So whether or not we like Chiefs for Change people or whatever, I'm thinking like we need somebody that understands the reorg, or we're just going to be in have the same problems.
I think that's one of the areas where the state has been negligent in their role. The state really should be providing oversight for the Clark County School District, and one of the things that they should be instructing on is like, okay, so this is how things are done here in the Clark County School District because this is what the law says. The problem with all of the reorg law and the ability to fight back or resist or passive aggressively drag your feet or whatever is that there's no consequences if they don't follow the law, except for the threat of a state takeover. The state doesn't want to take over the Clark County School District. Then they would be responsible for the Clark County School District. They don't want to be responsible for the Clark County School District.
I mean, currently, if you got people in those places that wanted to take it over
they're not
later
going
on, then they could do that.
Ultimately, they're not going to, because ultimately that would make them responsible, and then they'd have to admit that all of the things that they did that contributed to the dumpster fire that is the Clark County School District.
It's the reason why we didn't.
It's the reason why they didn't break the school district up into multiple small districts. That and the actual cost of things. The Clark County School District has the economies of scale that we lose if Henderson has its own school district, the city of Las Vegas has its own school district, North Las Vegas has its own school district. There's so many factors in there, but one of the biggest ones is the funding. We're already not paying enough to run it the way it should be run. And now we're going to have to pay more just to get to the same that we have right now.
Yeah,
we have
4
to pay,
superintendents, 4 deputy superintendents.
Well, and not only that, but just 4 transportation networks, 4 bus, 4 or however many we have, different people operating bus yards. And
then the logistics of like, are you in Clark County? And now you're on this line, so you're in this district.
Yeah, the logistics of all of it. Where do all the kids that go to LVA come from? And do they now no longer have access to that school? There aren't very many.
So the reorg was like, that was intended to be kind of like a solution to this. So here's what's interesting. You mentioned earlier, like there used to be all these mid-level superintendents and then they got taken away and now they've kind of started putting them back in. Well, what happened, again, me and Jara kind of came on at the same time.
Right.
He was here 6 months before me, but he made it very clear he hadn't done work. He hadn't changed a thing. So we really started at the same time. And the very first thing he did was to contract with the Council of Great City Schools to advise him in our operations. So they're advising him in our operations without understanding the reorg, right?
Right.
And Pat Skorkowski had put into a new operations chart into place, and I have it. So I have the old one and I have the new one. I have all the people in his cabinet, and this is why I use it as a document to prove that Jara's cabinet turnover is at like 450%, which is insane. Like he's had like 3 human resources people, 3 chiefs of staff, 3 deputies. It's crazy. But anyway, Reorg originally, the operations chart had like 16 or 17 positions that were associate superintendent. They had just gotten into place and they had just started representing like 17 different smaller areas in the district. But that was in alignment with the reorg. Pat Skorkowski did that. It didn't really fully execute because Jara came in and was like, this isn't how you run a school district. Get rid of them and put them all back in schools, and they became principals. And then years later, after we're getting in trouble from the State Department, he adds a handful of them, right, the same exact position, when really, I don't know if this first one would have worked or not, but it never got implemented because Jara came in with an agenda and a recipe for how to run a school district. So again, my whole purpose with the podcast and everything is to like try to give as much information as I can and hope that people come up with their own opinions and hope that they use that to speak to the board and whoever and have influence in their own way. But I do not see how we can be asking so deeply for an outsider. And I'm not against an outsider, truly, but at this moment in time, with the reorg, with where we are with the community, post-pandemic, at this point when we need to bridge with our teachers, and get community trust back and buy-in. And when we've learned that a lot of these things, like during the school closures, don't matter, these things we're focusing on, like how can everybody be so set on it must be an external candidate, somebody that has ran a large district somewhere else, when our unique problems like don't reflect that need per se. My opinion is like, take someone that used to be familiar with CCSD and has gone and done administrative somewhere else. We have a handful of people. I don't even know if I should name them because I don't want to like put a target on their back, but there's a handful of really good people that that aren't in like the group, what was it, the boys club that people referenced in CCSD, and they were like, you have to break up the boys club, that aren't in that group, who have what you've said, like experience in all levels of CCSD, they've left because they didn't want to work under Jara. And now they're doing really well as superintendents in other districts. To me, that's your pool of superintendents for
Oh,
going forward.
that's absolutely one. I think we have to look at everything, but that's one of the groups that you have to look at, and you have to give them a little bit more consideration because of their experience with Clark County, with Nevada, with the reorg, with all of the stuff. I've read the Jara's going away piece, but
Nonsense.
there are things about that came from him where it's not exactly wrong. I have
Sure.
a legislature that is saying you have to do this, and then at the same time you have to do this other thing that conflicts with the first thing that he's not wrong there. You know,
Mm.
I mean, I would say it like a broken clock is right twice a day. I mean, so those are very real things, and there are very real issues with the legislature and the state of Nevada doing things that make teaching our students and doing the best that we can for our students and helping our students achieve and become the best versions of themselves that they can be, that make that difficult. That's part of the job of the superintendent, is to try to navigate those things. And part of that is, or at least should be, the knowing, okay, so when do we push back on this and how do we push back? At the end of Skorkowski's term and throughout Superintendent Jara's term, we had a lot of kind of passive aggressive, we're just not going to do those things. And where we should have done is taken them to court. Um,
Sure.
there's a lot of things that funding, being one of them, specifically our special education uh, funding, um, where we really should be taking the state to court. There are mandates that have come down where we should have taken them to court. That's the place, based on our federal system, where you have different people who have different powers and kind of thing. That's one of the places that you go to settle things, is
Mm.
you take them to court. I mean, we have how many lawsuits against the Clark County School District on a regular basis, and we seem to fight all of them tooth and nail, and many of those we should have settled, but we won't take the people that we need to take to court. And
And sometimes you have to do that to get to a cohesive working relationship. Like, put it all on the table, figure out who's right or wrong, put it all out there, and then let's figure out how we can move forward.
exactly, and putting a bunch of different people in the same room and hashing it out isn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily a bad idea. The other thing too, of course, is that the legislature, they have elections every 2 years. We have different people coming in. They all have their own agendas. They all have their own thing. Yeah.
That's what I was earlier. I was saying, like, I just worry about, let's say that somehow somebody was able to hella do a good job at funding elections one year, and now you've got a legislature and a Senate and a state board that has predominantly one agenda, and that agenda is to take over the district. At that point, we've put them in a good position to be able to do so, with the way that the board is acting and with the way that it's being ran, and the ignoring of the reorg.
My view on that is that they've already started that process. They're not going to take it over outright, because again, then they'd be accountable for it. Instead, what they'll do is they're going to do the appointed board. This time they're appointed, but they don't get to vote. In the next legislative session, they will absolutely have the right to vote. Isolate the process, the democratic process, where the board is selected by the elected bodies of the different people
Yeah.
involved there. That would not surprise me at all. As a resident, as somebody who's part of the community, I wonder every day why anybody would take the job of a trustee in a place like the Clark County School District. It doesn't pay anything. It's a gigantic hassle.
You can make deals. I mean, Katie Williams got a job with one of our vendors, marketing. She sucks at marketing. It's like the stage production vendor.
Yeah, but that's a problem.
Right.
We've got somebody that works for an organization that gets money from the Clark County School District to do various things. We've got somebody that works for somebody who's providing for a school that provides services to students that don't do well in the Clark County School. We've got those conflicts of interest. There has to be a process or a mechanism where we could eliminate those conflicts of interest, and the only way to actually do that is to make the trustee an actual job that paid
Right.
enough for people to, you know, live doing that thing. And what we've created is a system that is inherently flawed and inherently creates conflicts of interest because that's the only way you can survive, you know.
So that's one of the things, like I'm not even saying this because I have an agenda or anything, but I may run for something in the future. I don't know what or when, not now, but anything that I did in the future would be related to the school board and specifically the board governance. And that's one of the things I've thought about. And what I would do is to make some harsh laws around conflict of interest and all these things that trustees should not be doing, and then always pay them the same as a starting teacher.
Yeah, and I don't think that a starting teacher's salary is adequate. That's $55,000 a year,
Right.
and that's you can't
So if
live
that's
in
what the
Las
board is
Vegas.
limited to, they're going to raise that salary pretty
Oh,
quickly.
well, yeah. I mean, the problem is that we've raised the starting salary significantly, but the people that are already there, that's like the floor comes up and the top goes up, but the people in the
Yeah.
middle are still here. And we know what it is, and it's John Vallardita and the refusal of the outgoing superintendent, who, I mean, if he actually wanted to do that, he could have actually done that. They were in the arbitration process. All he had to do was take it to the arbitration and go, look, we have this situation that is inherently unfair, and it makes it hard to retain teachers in the Clark County School District. We desperately need to retain teachers in the Clark County School District because there are nowhere near enough people entering teacher preparation programs where we can recruit our way out of the 1,600 plus vacancies that we're at. You know, when I started showing up at school board meetings and I was saying, look, we have 250 vacancies, and it's because of poor pay, declining benefits, and hostile working conditions. And you need to fix those things, or we're going to, that 250 vacancies is going to continue to grow. And it wasn't just me, there were others that were like, please address these issues, you know, when it was something that was relatively manageable. And now we're in a situation where we're over 1,600 teacher vacancies and another 1,000 support professional vacancies. And, you know, and it's like, and the solutions are easy. I mean, that doesn't mean, or they're simple. That doesn't mean they're easy. We have kids that wait because their bus is late an hour or an hour and a half. We have special needs kids who we're legally required to provide transportation for, who are waiting hours every day, either to get to school or to get home from school. And it's like, look, I get you don't want to sue the state. I get that that's hard. But when you're not able to provide the legally required minimum services, especially for our special needs students, then you have a problem. I mean, a third or more of our vacancies are in special education. We don't have enough of the paraprofessionals doing the assistant work with that. We don't have enough bus drivers providing the transportation services. We don't have enough of any of those things, and it's because we're not paying people enough. We're not providing quality benefits, and there's increasingly hostile working conditions. And those working conditions are, you know, vary from school to school.
So speaking to that, what are your thoughts? And I have some thoughts, but what are your thoughts on, let's say that the perfect superintendent got hired. Now, whatever that is, they're perfect, and the community loves them, and the legislators love this person, and they have the vision in mind, and they have the qualities and the skills, and they have the trust and support of educators. How do you think that that would affect our teacher shortage?
I don't know that it does. It doesn't drive people away the way the last superintendent did. That doesn't exist. There is no perfect person.
But like in the
I
fairyland, and this happened.
I know. In Fairyland, you still have the problem of inadequate pay, declining benefits, and uh, increasingly hostile for way too many teachers, increasingly hostile working conditions.
But
Now,
wouldn't that help the working conditions?
the perfect, well, I mean, it can, but how many people, how many building level administrators does the superintendent, the perfect fairyland superintendent, actually supervise and influence? You know, and even if we're getting into a situation where you've got the perfect superintendent and all of the deputy and associate superintendents underneath him are perfect, and then it becomes all of the building level principals are perfect, and then all of, you know, then yes, the big part of that hostile working condition aspect of it goes away. But it still doesn't address the stuff that comes from outside of the building. It still doesn't address the problems that we have inside the building. Some of our hostile working conditions for at least some of our teachers are coming from the students
Students and
themselves.
parents, yeah.
And it's because they have unmet needs. And as a school, as a district, we're not able to meet those needs. And the fact that society is saying the school has to handle those things in the first place is absurd. But we do. And that then we get to, the do we have enough counselors? Do we have enough school psychs? Do we have enough social workers? Do we have the wraparound services? Are students getting fed at home? Do our parents have jobs that pay the bills and put a roof over their head and put food on the table? And all of those things. And so we've got so many moving parts. Now, would a phenomenal, ideal superintendent help alleviate those problems? Would it lessen those things? Of course it would. But we have a whole system, the whole country, systemic problems that until we as a country decide we're going to actually fix those things and provide those things, we're not going to fix and we're not going to provide. Education has been chronically underfunded for decades. We rely on teachers doing it for the kids. We chronically underfund and underpay teachers because, well, when when the whole thing started, most of those people were women. I mean, most teachers in America today are women, and it's assumed that they're going to have husbands who are going to earn more money, and and so we have problems getting men into the system of education. We have, we're discriminating against the whole profession because most of the people in the profession are women, and so we're discriminating against women because we have a problem as a country paying women a fair wage for what they do. Again, that whole you're going to do it because it's what's best for kids. And as a teacher, I know we've all done things, we've all spent money out of our own pockets that we didn't have because our kids needed it. I mean, during the Great Recession, when my wife was unemployed and we were living on one relatively new teacher's salary, was still spending my own money to pay for things for my students because they weren't provided by my school, by the state, by anybody. So we've got that whole thing. So yes, it will absolutely help, but you've got people that are purposely undermining the whole system, and they're doing it for a variety of different reasons. I have pointed to the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education as a principal cause there, where people essentially want to segregate schools again. Our schools have already essentially been segregated again, but then you've got the people who are trying to reform the school system because they figured out a way to monetize that reform. They've figured out how to make money on it. And so you've got all of these different organizations, all of the different people that are working to reform our school systems in such a way that it enriches themselves. And that's where we get Chiefs for Change, we get the Broad Institute, we get the Council of Great City Schools, we get all of the different companies that provide the different education materials that go with that. And some of those education materials are actually useful and actually helpful. Some of them are horrible.
I'm not going to I'm not an educator. I haven't been an educator. I'm not going to give you my opinion based on my educator experience. I don't have it. So
right.
With respect to your experience of that, based on things that I've heard and seen, and me being an eternal optimist, I actually feel that if we had a new superintendent that earned the trust and teachers were given respect from school administrators and district-wide, system-wide autonomy, that it could bring a lot of people back. The amount of people that have told me they left because of those three things, knowing that there's no hope with the superintendent there, and they've lost their autonomy and they're not respected by their administrators or the deputy, and Jara bought out a bunch of administrators. I feel like there's at least enough people to come back to make a substantial dent. And so that's almost something I want to explore. I'm interested to find out exactly how many people would come back under not even ideal conditions, but just a little bit better conditions, hopeful conditions, maybe. And if that would at least make a dent in our teacher shortage exodus problem, because the people are here in Las Vegas. we have the humans in the city
There are
to
there
solve
are
that
enough
problem.
licensed teachers in the Clark County that could come back and be teachers in Clark County, but for leadership, building level admin, pay, benefits, and the working conditions thing, that they've left. I'm making an assumption based on uh, the things that people who have left have told me. Um, and it's the things that I've been telling the Clark County School District trustees and
A
the,
three-legged stool,
the,
like you always
the
say.
last three or the last two superintendents, the three-legged stool, the pay, benefits, and working conditions. The superintendent that just left us managed to get a whole bunch of pretty good administrators, good to really great administrators to leave. That's going to
Yeah,
hurt us for a while.
that can make a difference.
That's going to
Yes.
hurt us for a while because there's no critical shortage of administrators. They can't come back and still collect their pensions.
Well, you have Carrie Larner just became a teacher again.
Yeah,
She
well,
retired and she just became a teacher
I
again.
mean, Dr. Kuzma, he left
Yeah.
Rancho
Yep.
and became a deputy superintendent and went, nope, and retired. And he's teaching math at East Career and Technical Academy. And his students are better for it.
When I first joined the board, you had a fun little nickname for me.
Oh, God.
What was it?
When you were running, I was like, oh, God, we're going to end up with Trustee Barbie. And and then you were on the board, and like the first meeting or two, I was like, oh, Jesus, Trustee Barbie. And it just like, and then I heard you actually talk about things. And then I heard you talk from an informed position. I heard you advocating for our students and advocating for our support staff and advocating for our teachers and all of that. And I went, oh my God, I did that thing that you're not supposed to do where you judge somebody. And I haven't done it since. I've had other, like where my gut reaction or my initial reaction was to say it's like this thing or that thing or whatever kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been like, no, let's find out who they actually are. And most of the time, my initial reaction was right. And I cannot tell you how grateful I am that my initial reaction of you was so far off. And not only that, but the person that was running against you in that election, who everybody that I knew was like, oh, this is the great person. She's going to be a fantastic trustee. Everything she said since then has been cringy. And I'm like, obviously everybody makes mistakes. Everybody does things. Everybody says, but every single thing that you haven't nailed from the get-go, you owned those and you learned from them and you grew from them and you made, connections to people in the community. And, it's like, why don't other people do that? Um, you know, there are other trustees and they could very easily admit that they made mistakes and learn from them and take steps to correct them. And most of them don't. Most of them have decided that the way that they think things should be done is absolutely the way things should be done, and they know better, even though they're not teachers either. They've never been in classrooms either, and most of that is because of who they work for. So
yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. But even when you told me that much later, and I laughed just like I did
oh
right
yeah,
now,
yeah, you thought it was
I'm
hysterical.
like, you know what though? Barbie is a hero. Not just like the new Barbie movie or the original Barbie, but in like all of the movies I've seen, the books I've read, she has, first of all, amazing hair. And she always has a little fluffy animal with her. And she's always like the hero of the story and like bringing joy to the people. And I'm like, joke's on you, because she is like my shiro. So, well, I'm going to let you go. Robert, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for doing this podcast and for spending all this time and just divulging all that info, but also over the years, you've been like such a huge resource to me. I've called you numerous times for more like depth of information on certain subjects, and even the things that you said in public comment and things that you put online have majorly informed me and, set me in the right direction for a lot of things. So I honestly wouldn't even be doing this podcast, or I wouldn't have even been as good of a trustee as I.
So you're saying the podcast is
tried to be. Yeah, this is your fault. You guys blame Robert. Okay. No, I would be much more lost than I am without you. Even if it wasn't you guiding me, I took all your stuff as guidance for me to jump off of later on. So I really appreciate you, and I hope you know that you are making a big impact in CCSD, even if you're frustrated with it and you
Like
are not talking as much as you were.
feels
You've
like
really made a
it
difference.
feels like I spent years tilting at windmills only to get knocked over and
I know. I
crap
read all your stuff in the minutes, and I watched all the videos of you speaking in the past few years, and I can absolutely understand why you say that. But I'm doing the work now. Eventually, I'll feel like that, and someone else will be doing the work. And there's lots of people working on this, and it trickles down. So
It
thank you for
does. It
everything you've
does.
done. It's
I
made a
mean, there were
difference.
people before me. There were people with me while I was doing it.
Yep.
I went back the other day and I was like, nothing has changed.
Yeah, I know.
um, it was nice to see, like a full boardroom of people that were all saying essentially the same thing.
I agree.
So
It's like if we could all get on the same page with this, maybe we can get on the same page with something else. Like we can make change somehow.
yeah, maybe.
Maybe we'll find out. Well, Robert, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Go enjoy your cats, and Sarah, tell her thank you for your time, for lending you out, and she's going to have to watch the podcast to see what we talk about. All right, a lot was mentioned in this interview. Robert and I veered away from the topic at hand quite a few times, but we always found our way back. I would love to hear your thoughts, especially about the upcoming CCSD superintendent hiring process, and whether or not you think that a great new superintendent could begin to repair the teacher shortage crisis in CCSD. I'd love to hear from educators who have left CCSD within the last few years and who still live in Clark County. So please share this episode directly with them if you know anybody. Unraveling Education is propelled by donations from viewers and listeners. If you're digging this content and you want to help, visit unravelingeducation.com/sponsor. You can also support the show by sharing on social media, making sure you're subscribed on YouTube, or leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thank you for tuning in, and until we meet again, keep pulling those threads.